All right. So, I had fully intended to present a paper called "We Have Never Been Post-Metaphysical," but it didn't ever take on the form that I wanted it to. So, this was my plan B. And what this paper is basically about are just some methodological issues in phenomenology that I've been trying to work through, and I wrote about in the Phenomenology book that Justin just mentioned. But before I get started, I have to thank Justin and Jeremy for putting on this unique, para-academic event, which is fantastic, and Jeff for hosting it, and apologize to everybody that I couldn't be here. If you gave a paper today, I had to teach all day. I didn't get back to the city until 5 o'clock, so I took care of the cat and, ate something and came here. So I apologize for that and for also changing my paper. So I'm going to try and keep it under an hour. I'm sorry it's a little bit long, but I'm going to just jump right into it. So discontent with the legacy of the linguistic turn and eager to bring the discourse of the end of metaphysics to a close, continental philosophy has in recent years taken a speculative turn. The speculative turn is marked by a desire to bring ontology back into the spotlight, to establish new forms of realism and materialism, and to revitalize metaphysics after its suspension by phenomenology and its offshoots, hermeneutics and deconstruction. But does metaphysics really come to an end in any sense with phenomenology? Or does phenomenology actually get us back to the things themselves? Or does it just offer us a kind of semblance of realism, which is to say, no realism at all? My contention is that phenomenology has shown itself to do two incompatible things. On the one hand, it offers a kind of quasi-realism free of metaphysical commitments. On the other hand, it makes metaphysical realist commitments that transgress its methodological boundaries. And this incompatibility results in large part, I think, because phenomenology lacks a consistent methodology. So if it's realism you want, there are better places to find it in contemporary continental philosophy. And my suggestion is that you can find it in what's called speculative realism. I'm going to mention speculative realism a couple of times throughout the paper, but I don't really go into it. So we can talk about what that is afterward, but just so we have something to hold on to. I take speculative realism to be a kind of loose umbrella term that encapsulates a handful of thinkers in the continental tradition these days who are interested specifically with questions of realism. So everybody always concludes people like Graham Harman and Meillassoux and Ian Hamilton Grant and Ray Brazier, but there are a bunch of other people that I think could be lumped in as speculative realists, even though everybody right now denies that they're a speculative realist, and lots of people deny that it's even a thing. So we could talk about that afterward. I'm going to talk mostly about phenomenology. So first, the question of method. While not all variants of speculative realism borrow from the literature of phenomenology, all of them do share the phenomenological aspiration to engage reality on its own terms, whatever that means. But can this aspiration be fulfilled? This question, I think, provokes the question of method. How do we actually get to the real? And which school is best equipped to put us in touch with it? On the face of it, both phenomenology and speculative realism steer continental philosophy onto the road out of Kantian idealism and into what Quentin Meillassoux has called the quote-unquote great outdoors of realism. Throughout the 20th century, it was phenomenology that promised to get us back to the things themselves, or back in touch with the world of lived experience as it is lived. But what phenomenology actually delivers is a subtler version, this is my contention, of the Kantian world for us, not the world of real or material things as they are in themselves. Phenomenology does not get us to the noumenal or to the essence of things. It instead keeps us, I think, chained to the phenomenal where we have been all along. I know this is contentious to say this kind of thing in this space, but I thought, why not? Despite appearances, only speculative realism can actually get us out of Kant's shadow. This requires a radically different method than the one introduced by Husserl and modified by his descendants. For anyone searching for a realist alternative to the Kantian program, phenomenology appears as a dead end that leaves its practitioners gesturing towards the outside without ever actually stepping out of the house. This paper explores the problem with defining the method of phenomenology and suggests that it's actually the rhetoric of phenomenology that gives phenomenology a kind of feel of realism without actually delivering a realist metaphysics. So my claim is that methodology and phenomenology isn't quite consistent, that phenomenology actually has a kind of realist aspiration to it, but it never actually delivers that realism, right? It has the feel of realism, but it's not actual realism. It would be inaccurate to claim that either phenomenology or speculative realism adheres to any standard or univocal method. The various figures gathered under the speculative realist label deploy disparate methodologies, although each in their own way attempts to overcome the anti-realist hegemony in continental philosophy, which may or may not have already come to some sort of closure. Towards this end, they share a willingness to speculate about things metaphysical, and some more than others to construct original ontologies. This compels them to reach beyond the finite limits of perception, historicity, and language. Another thing shared by the multiple variants of speculative realism is a rejection of the ontological primacy of the correlation of thought and being, also called correlationism. Not all of them reject the legitimacy of the correlation as such, but all do agree that there is much more to the real than what appears within human consciousness. There is, however, much disagreement about just how to characterize the real. Phenomenology, by contrast, is exclusively committed to investigating only those dimensions of human experience that take shape within the correlation of thought and being. To be sure, it explicitly focuses philosophy's lens on what is evidenced within this correlation. Although each phenomenologist assumes this task in their own idiosyncratic way, each one is bound to the methodology, which, however it is construed, eschews metaphysical speculation. Unlike speculative realism, phenomenology purports to practice something called phenomenology, while few, if any, speculative realists pledge their allegiance to something like a speculative realist methodology. Despite their resolution to speak only of what is evidenced in the correlation of consciousness and world, it's not difficult to find a phenomenologist making metaphysical assertions. Even Husserl and Heidegger make metaphysical claims that are not legitimated by phenomenological evidence. Phenomenologically speaking, these claims are illegitimate precisely because phenomenology is supposed to be metaphysically neutral on the existence of the things of the world. This is the meaning of the phenomenological device known as the phenomenological epoche, which is Husserl's analog to the radical methodological doubt implemented by Descartes in the Meditations. The epoche does not force the phenomenologist to actually doubt the existence of the world as it appears, but merely prevents her from making any assertion about the objective existence of things. As such, it cannot be metaphysically realist. Such assertions about what does and does not actually or objectively exist are akin to non sequiturs, in the sense that they do not follow from and are not supported by the phenomenological method. Just as the empiricist method deployed by somebody like Hume in a text like Of Miracles could never justify a commitment by Hume to the existence of miracles, phenomenology cannot justify commitments to what is not disclosed phenomenologically. And much of what realism is committed to is never disclosed phenomenologically. This is not to say that a transcendental phenomenologist is not permitted to hold realist commitments. What I mean to specify is that those commitments are not the product of phenomenological method or phenomenological description. Phenomenology, I contend, must lead necessarily to either anti-realism or metaphysical agnosticism. It therefore cannot be realist because its method prohibits the kind of speculation required for grounding realism in philosophical argument. This kind of speculation is what we get in speculative realism. So what I'm calling the speculative difference is the willingness of speculative realism to actually speculate about what's beyond, right? Precisely the kind of thing that's prohibited by phenomenology. Now, Husserl founded the phenomenological movement by perpetually writing, rewriting, and beginning to write books and lectures that would define the precise principles of the phenomenological method and shape it into a quote-unquote rigorous science. It's now commonplace to point to this constant rewriting and rethinking to epitomize Husserl's work in essence, or to characterize phenomenology's approach to philosophy. It is often regarded as one of its virtues, this perpetual beginning, right? Even today, the critical edge of phenomenology is lauded as a kind of perpetual self-rejuvenation for which phenomenology is ready to ransom all the prestige attached to a mature, tried, and tested doctrine. That was me quoting Michael Marder in a recent essay. Husserl was never satisfied with the presentation, which means that would-be phenomenologists are left without a definitive statement from Husserl himself of how properly to conduct a phenomenological investigation. They are likewise without a proper understanding of how far phenomenology can take us towards solving the classical problems of philosophy. This is no doubt a crucial reason for the methodological disparity among phenomenologists. Nevertheless, it must be possible to establish at least what Husserl considered the necessary or minimal elements of phenomenological method, however minimal these elements may be. Without these elements, is it possible to even know how to practice phenomenology? If the method of phenomenology is uncertain, it's difficult to see how its results could be reliable, let alone rigorously scientific. As Husserl writes, only a quote-unquote positive criticism of principles of method can give us confidence in the possibility of scientific philosophy. Now, if Husserl saw this clearly, his followers, it seems, remain less concerned about securing the integrity of their method or the rigorousness of their method. Many, since Husserl, have asked about the meaning of phenomenology, and still no consensus exists. Methodologically speaking, this is phenomenology's fateful or perhaps fatal vice. Husserl's descendants, often the most prominent, rarely take his efforts to establish the science of phenomenology as seriously as he did. As Dermot Moran has noted following Paul Ricoeur, quote, "Phenomenology is the story of the deviations from Husserl. The history of phenomenology is the history of Husserlian heresies," end quote. Husserl's followers interpret and apply phenomenology as they wish, often preferring to reroute it down a less scientific or more existential path. It's generally reconceived as the philosophy that dispenses with abstractions in order to get us back in touch with what it's like to live and think in the real world. Some, including Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty, downplay or outright reject the idea of phenomenology as a strict philosophical method. But if it's not a method, then what is it? More than 40 years after Husserl published his logical investigations in 1901, Merleau-Ponty expressed wonder that this question was still unanswered. So he took the opportunity to once again redefine phenomenology, as Heidegger and others had done before him. In the preface to the Phenomenology of Perception, he decides that phenomenology is not really a method, but instead a kind of style of philosophy. Quote, "The opinion of the responsible philosopher must be that phenomenology can be practiced and identified as a manner or a style of thinking, that it existed as a movement before arriving at complete awareness of itself as a philosophy," end quote. Now, if it does not render meaningless the allegiance to phenomenology, an interpretation like this definitely calls into question the integrity of the phenomenologist's method, even as it insists that, quote, "phenomenology is accessible only through a phenomenological method," end quote. It basically casts phenomenology's net too wide and does little to prevent us from gathering a whole range of philosophers and non-philosophers under the umbrella of phenomenology, whether they self-identify as phenomenologists or not. It allows someone like Moran to count Hannah Arendt amongst the important figures in the phenomenological movement, despite the fact that Arendt, quote, "exhibited no particular interest in the phenomenological method and contributed nothing to the theory of phenomenology." It's Moran, end quote. For Moran, it's enough that Arendt's work, quote, "can be fruitfully understood as a species of phenomenology," end quote. This is only possible, however, because Moran vaguely and typically defines phenomenology as a, quote, "anti-traditional style of philosophizing, which emphasizes the attempt to get to the truth of matters, to describe phenomena, in the broadest sense, as whatever appears in the manner in which it appears, that is, as it manifests itself to consciousness, to the experiencer," end quote. For me, vagueness of this sort does not help us understand what makes phenomenology unique, and in fact seems to implicate more than one school of philosophy, as well as some other fields of inquiry, like ethnography, for instance. Moran's definition, along with many others, has a post hoc ring to it, and seems motivated in part by a desire to have the definition apply to anyone who has been called a phenomenologist, as well as many who have not been called phenomenologists. On this definition, we could call Melville a phenomenologist of whaling, or Thoreau a phenomenologist of walking, or Foucault a phenomenologist of power. A post hoc definition cannot satisfy the demands of method, I think, which needs to be worked out prior to the study it's meant to guide. Nearly all of the major phenomenologists see phenomenology as a method, which means they see it as directed by a certain set of principles or attitudes that circumscribe its practice. This view is shared by Husserl, Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, Sartre, Levinas, Ricoeur, Marion, many others. Even in their disagreement about what precisely is entailed in it, they recognize that liberties cannot be taken when trying to pin down a philosophical method without compromising the very integrity of that method. A method is supposed to rein in spurious conjecture and speculative impulse, not send out search parties in every direction. Absent a clear method, we are not unlike, as Descartes says, quote, someone who is consumed with such a senseless desire to discover treasure that he continually roams the streets to see if he can find any that a passerby might have dropped, end quote. A trustworthy method is necessary if we wish to be more than fortunate in our philosophical investigations. So what exactly is a method? I think Descartes gives us the following definition in Rule 4 of the Rules for the Direction of the Mind. And this is not the only possible definition, but it comes from the philosopher who provides Husserl with his model of methodological reflection, and is presumably sufficient for this moment here. Descartes says, by a method, I mean reliable rules which are easy to apply, and such that if one follows them exactly, one will never take what is false to be true, or fruitlessly expend one's mental efforts, but will gradually and constantly increase one's knowledge till one arrives at a true understanding of everything that's within one's capacity. End of the quote. So in one sense, a method is about conserving our energy, right? Ensuring efficiency, guaranteeing accuracy, and growing our knowledge. In another sense, a method is about restricting what can and cannot be said, what counts as a legitimate statement and what does not. When John Watson, the behavioral psychologist, for example, lays down the methodological guidelines of behaviorism, he explicitly puts the domain of introspection out of play from the behaviorist standpoint. This is why we would and should be suspicious if Watson were to begin talking about the mental life the way that, say, William James does. It's precisely the prohibition against this kind of talk that not only defines Watson's method, but also provokes someone like James or Merleau-Ponty to devise a new approach to account for the complexity of human behavior, subjectivity, one that allows him, that is Merleau-Ponty or James, to say more about mental life than the behaviorist allows us to say. This is one way to think about method, right, as a device that enables its adherents to make statements that are not authorized for non-adherents. Right? So one way to think about method as a device that enables its adherents to make statements that are not authorized by for non-adherents. To be clear, it is neither authority nor power that authorizes these statements. It's the method itself, right? The rules that one follows, the principles that one is committed to. A method opens up a new domain of speech and is precisely what guarantees the legitimacy of that speech. Husserl was no foreigner to Cartesian method, which clearly instructs us to order our thoughts and stick to our principles when attempting to extract the truth of experience. For the phenomenologist, unlike Descartes himself, legitimacy is garnered by the fulfillment of an intention in experience underwritten by the certainty or givenness of subjectivity. Now, Husserl's phenomenology develops in response to a perceived crisis in the sciences and in philosophy. The crisis is the result of a certain, as he puts it, corruption of existence, or a corruption of the spirit of humanity in early 20th century Europe. The corrupting force, according to Husserl, is what he calls the exteriorization of reason in the naturalistic objectivism that dominates the science of his day. Naturalism attempts to subject every domain of existence to the rigor of mathematical science, and ideally limit the sayable to the language of mathematics. At the heart of this crisis is the Cartesian conviction that everything, including human consciousness, can be quantified and thereby understood, the dream of a mathesis universalis. Phenomenological method for Husserl is supposed to resolve this crisis by humbling the tendencies of naturalism and calling radically into question the presuppositions of the objectivist sciences and philosophy. Phenomenology then is the antidote to the kind of naturalism that, quote, alienates the immortal human spirit by reducing it to third-person natural knowledge. But this antidote cannot be administered without first neutralizing the philosophical foundation of a dualistic naturalism, namely the view that both nature and spirit are realities, right, in the same sense. For Husserl, only spirit is truly real in the sense of autonomous, in itself, and for itself. Nature, by contrast, is the product of the spirit that studies it. I just want to call attention to, this is I'm quoting Husserl from the Philosophy and the Crisis of European Man, that essay. Only once the neutralization of naive naturalism is accomplished, can the essence of spirit be reclaimed from the clutches of barbaric naturalism. Transcendental phenomenology is the only method equipped for the scientific study of spirit and the legitimation of statements about nature, spirit, the ego, consciousness, and their internal relation. Now, in an exposition of the meaning of the phrase "to the things themselves" found in the 1925 lecture course History of the Concept of Time, Heidegger attempts to pinpoint the meaning of phenomenological method, or the meaning of method in general, I should say. He is obviously attempting to characterize phenomenology. As someone grappling with the prospect of phenomenology as a method, he helps us get a handle on what Husserl was up to in his attempt to burrow beneath the method of naturalism, which, in his view, brought about the crisis to which phenomenology is the only philosophical response. For Heidegger, method is one of the basic components of what he calls a principle of research. It is the, quote, principle of developing the way of dealing with a subject matter, end quote. It is clear that for Heidegger, the way of dealing with the matters themselves, which is the most general object of phenomenological research, is not via a constructive or a speculative route. This way, he says, is quote-unquote groundless. A grounded approach is one that, quote, autochthonously demonstrative, and which, quote, lays the foundation for this demonstration. For phenomenology, the demonstrable, is what is evidenced in the phenomena themselves, not what is deduced from the idea of the things themselves or from the idea of phenomenology. Phenomenology is not a deductive method, but as it were, we could say, adductive method, in the sense that it is committed to adducing the matters themselves through concrete experience. The matters themselves are the source of the method, as it were. This principle of research is not plucked out of thin air, Heidegger insists, but is something gleaned, quote, from its concretion in the research work itself. For Husserl, as well as Heidegger, by focusing on the, quote, concrete things themselves, we are led back into the ground of experience. We lay open the foundation of experience and are ultimately referred to the dimension of intentionality. Intentionality informs the subject matter of phenomenological research. Or, in Heidegger's words, quote, phenomenology is the analytic description of intentionality in its a priori, end quote. Phenomenology is a transcendental investigation into the ground of the matters themselves as they give themselves. It is thus a methodological term. This is Heidegger again, inasmuch as it is only used to designate the mode of experience, apprehension, and determination of that which is thematized in philosophy. So Heidegger eventually drops or turns away from all intensive study of this conception of method. There is more than a little irony in the fact that Husserl worked tirelessly to crystallize a method that would avoid needless philosophical toil, only to come up short and have his project pushed ahead in spirit, but nowhere near the letter, or pushed ahead not near the letter, I should say. Few today see phenomenology as a scientific endeavor, and only some as a propedeutic to science. It's no longer apparent how phenomenology is to be carried out, or how it differs from, say, thick empirical description or poetic embellishment, depending on the phenomenology. This is not to say that phenomenology can be reduced to mere rhetoric, or to claim that phenomenology has never achieved a coherent approach to philosophical problems, but to suggest that perhaps its meaning has proliferated beyond coherence, rendering phenomenology such a diluted term that any activity could qualify as phenomenological in nature. Many practices and inquiries are called phenomenological, but like the term game, to borrow Wittgenstein's example, a refined definition that covers all of them, right? All instances of phenomenology seems to be lacking. This may not seem like a problem. It may sound like a naive Socratic worry, right? In response, it's tempting to insist that phenomenology is better regarded as a family resemblance term. This would permit the practice of phenomenology to be as diverse as the worlds it aims to unveil. It would permit the inclusion of Wittgenstein, Ryle, Austin, Cavell, McDowell, and Putnam in the canon of phenomenology. For after all, each of them bear a quote-unquote methodological affinity with Husserl, Heidegger, and Merleau-Ponty. This is something that Simon Glendening argues in his book, In the Name of Phenomenology. So Glendening argues for this in the Name of Phenomenology, as does Francois David Sebag's Testing the Limit, and the authors of the New Phenomenology, J. Aaron Simmons and Bruce Ellis Benson. Phenomenology, Glendening says, it's a hard name to say out loud, Glendening says, is more about the method, the how, than it is about the content or the what, right, of philosophy. It's not, he says, a set of doctrines. It is about paying closer attention to the appearances that present themselves to subjective experience. Now, how is this done exactly? How do you pay closer attention to things? He does not really say in his book. He prefers to keep the definition, as he puts it, skeletal, to avoid drawing too much attention to particular phenomenological texts. Nevertheless, he enumerates 3 possible answers to the question of phenomenology's content, including 1. Phenomenology is the legitimate heir to what used to be called philosophy. 2. Phenomenology is the philosophical answer to modern scientific naturalism. Okay. Number 3. Phenomenology is quote, a work of convincing words that allows us to retrieve a radical understanding of ourselves and our place in the world. So instead of a singular definition of phenomenology, now we have 3 different definitions, none of which spell out the methodological principles of phenomenology. Socrates would not be pleased. The latter, I realized when I'm writing this paper in the book, I was like, I'm really Socratic, Platonic, and I don't know if that's reactionary or not, so you guys can attack me if you want to. The latter, I was like, well, I'm getting old, that's the sign, right? The latter 2, so Socrates would not be pleased. The latter 2 formulations characterize phenomenology as basically an ideological reply to the worldview of techno-scientific rationality and culture. These capture the historical spirit of Husserl's motivation for founding phenomenology, but they do not clarify the nature of phenomenology as a philosophical practice. As for the first definition, right, phenomenology is the legitimate heir to what used to be called philosophy. It's fair enough to call phenomenology the future of philosophy after modernity. This is what Husserl explicitly does in Cartesian Meditations, but once again, it doesn't specify what it takes to actually do phenomenology. Glendening's distillation of phenomenology is symptomatic as well as emblematic of the way phenomenology has been dissociated from its method. Today, anything is called phenomenology so long as it involves some kind of subjective description of experience. It seems to me, anyway. Note also that Glendening's formulations do not represent phenomenology as fundamentally concerned with intuiting essences or eidetic intuition or elaborating the essential structures of consciousness or intentionality or anything like that. These days, there's deep disagreement about how important this kind of essentialism is to the phenomenological project. It's often ridiculed as merely a symptom of Husserl's latent modernism or idealism, but it is still used to identify the work of phenomenology in individual thinkers. Whenever a philosopher pays especially close attention to a particular region of experience and attempts to lay out the essential features of that region, this practice is often identified as phenomenology. The working assumption here is that this is what phenomenology actually does. So when Moran calls Hannah Arendt a phenomenologist of public space or of publicness, he no doubt means that her work is remarkably attuned to public life and more than capable of extracting the essential features of public life. Nevertheless, as Dan Zahavi points out, quote, this interest in essential structures is so widespread and common in the history of philosophy that it's nonsensical to take it as a defining feature of phenomenology, end quote. If phenomenology is about intuiting essences as opposed to establishing facts or empirical evidence, then it still remains to be asked how these essences are to be seen after all. It's arguable that Husserl was the only person who believed in and sought them with anything like methodological rigor. So, if there's no singular methodological thread linking the practice of phenomenology, then what does link it? If Merleau-Ponty is right to call phenomenology a style of thinking, then it must be that style which allows practitioners to, as Raymond Aron put it to Sartre, quote, talk about this cocktail and make a philosophy out of it, end quote. Now, anyone could talk about a cocktail. Hopefully we'll talk about cocktails after my talk. I realize I'm the only thing left between you and cocktails, and it's a difficult place to be in, but bear with me. I tell my students my last class on Fridays that they're the only thing between me and not cocktails, but the weekend. William James, to be sure, could talk philosophically about a cocktail, but he is not considered a phenomenologist, although the case has been made for his inclusion in the phenomenological movement, and no doubt it is his literary style that affiliates him with phenomenology. His inclusion, however, really disrupts the narrative because so much of his work predates Husserl's inaugural logical investigations. And pointing to his style does not get us any closer to understanding what phenomenology as a philosophical practice requires. It simply leads us to ask what it is about a description of the world that makes it phenomenological, if it is not the description's concern for the essential structure of intentional experience. For every philosophical description, we must provide some criteria that would enable us to differentiate the phenomenological from the non-phenomenological. And at this point, it's not clear that this can be done. As Heidegger writes, quote, phenomenological, that term, signifies everything that belongs to such a way of exhibiting phenomena and phenomenal structures, everything that becomes thematic in this kind of research. The unphenomenological would be everything that does not satisfy this kind of research, its conceptuality, and its methods of demonstration, end quote. It's not even clear if such a circumscription is desirable or even useful. At any rate, the burden of proof, it seems to me, lies on the shoulders of anyone who holds that phenomenology actually exists as a coherent approach. Now, philosophers in the Anglo-American tradition can be heard calling phenomenology an enterprise, quote, as moribund as logical positivism, unquote. That's plucked from Leiter's blog. While countless figures writing in the wake of deconstruction treat it with the kind of contempt Heideggerians reserve for Platonic ontotheology and Cartesian substance ontology. This attitude fails to appreciate the continuing vitality of phenomenology. Many phenomenology journals remain active. Numerous international conferences are held each year. There's a society in the Nordic countries that's very lively. Scholarly societies everywhere continue to convene annually to talk about phenomenology. The theological turn taken by figures like Marion and Henri and Levinas and so forth, all of whom were sharply chastised in Dominique Janicot's Phenomenology and the Theological Turn, remains a fertile site of phenomenological research. Ideologically, it is quite invested in phenomenology's recover, the new phenomenology, that is, or the theological turn, in the wake of what Glendinning calls the modernist predicament. Ideologically, it's quite invested in phenomenology's recovery of lived experience in every single one of its dimensions, particularly the religious. Phenomenology continues as a viable research strategy for social scientists who are disaffected by more positivistic or quantitative models. And perhaps the most promising program is charted by people like Francisco Varela, Evan Thompson, Dan Zahavi, Sean Gallagher, and others. This is the attempt to naturalize phenomenology or otherwise synthesize it with the hard sciences, a project which seems more than a little paradoxical insofar as phenomenology is originally constituted by a suspension of the natural sciences and the naive metaphysical attitude that they presuppose. Now, at this point, it remains unclear to me whether the naturalization of phenomenology would signal the abolition of the ideology motivating the theological turn, or instead solidify with hard facts the justification of that ideology. In any event, we will not determine here if this marriage is methodologically misguided or not. It should be noted instead that the proliferation of such attempts testifies, to wed phenomenology and the hard sciences, testifies against those who would proclaim phenomenology a moribund program like Brian Leiter, to the health of phenomenological research. This is not to say that many people working in phenomenology do not take its promise for granted or sugarcoat its apparent incoherence. Okay, so part of the problem seems to be that phenomenology has become so diffuse that its methodology seems no longer relevant to its practice. Ever since Heidegger, the project of realizing phenomenology as a rigorous science, complete with a worked-out method of investigation, has been abandoned. This is already evident in Being and Time. In this respect, phenomenology began and in a sense ended with Husserl. Insofar as phenomenology lives on today, we must ask what it seeks to accomplish. Does it have a clear telos? What end does it have in view? Here, I simply want to endorse that there is promise in contemporary phenomenological research, while at the same time suggesting that something like speculative realism is better equipped to achieve some of phenomenology's philosophical ends, particularly its realist aspiration, if in fact there is a kind of realist aspiration in phenomenology. Phenomenology, I contend, should give up completely on realism and package itself instead as a hyper-formidable idealism. It should just embrace it. Right? It's like once Husserl made this sort of idealist turn, everybody ran away from that turn in Husserl. Right? This is not idealism. I think they should go back to that and embrace that. Like that's, I think, one of the futures of phenomenology, is to embrace that idealism. While phenomenologists are often keen to present themselves as thinkers committed to the reality, if not materiality, as in Henri, of the world they describe, phenomenology is a poor conduit for delivering genuine realism. On the contrary, phenomenology is a brilliant vehicle for anti-realism in the Kantian vein. And if phenomenology is going to thrive in the contemporary philosophical milieu, it might do well to enthusiastically embrace its anti-realist potential rather than disavowing it. This is a prospect that will inevitably appear unattractive to the adherents of the theological turn, but it is, I think, the best live option. As a method for realists, phenomenology, I think, has worn itself out. Phenomenology, if it means anything, is simply not a method that can commit itself to the human independent reality of bodies, objects, qualities, properties, materiality, or events, so forth. Now, this position will no doubt sound counterintuitive to anyone who has found in phenomenology an ally of the philosophy of embodiment. Even as early as Husserl, but especially after Merleau-Ponty, the body is situated at the center of the phenomenological standpoint. Given the embodied character of our experience, our embeddedness in the life world assumes priority over dispassionate theoretical analysis in the quest for objective perspective or some kind of view from nowhere. If practice always comes before theory, the story goes, then the ideal objects of theory cannot be detached from the living, breathing Umwelt that supports the practice of thinking. This priority is again and again underscored by the phenomenologist, often as a way to remind the reader of phenomenology that this is a real, tangible life we're talking about here, not some docile mental construction or aloof realm of innocuous abstract entities. The phenomenologist is no armchair spectator after all. From all of this sort of rhetoric, we're meant to infer, explicitly, we're told sometimes, that there is a world out there that precedes our existence, and especially our thought. It's much more than a construction. It exceeds the finitude of human life and thought. Into this reality we are thrown. It receives us because it's always already there, awaiting our birth and outliving our death. Phenomenology then is replete with what I call a rhetoric of concreteness that testifies to its realist credentials. But I don't think this rhetoric shouldn't blind us to the fact that phenomenology remains a poor choice for metaphysical realism, precisely because its method prohibits the phenomenologist from actually committing to a reality outside of human thought. I say that I don't really go into it here, but in another piece, I sort of lay out some of these assertions that you find in phenomenology, where they go through these long sort of phenomenological analyses, which would give you the impression that the world is just, as we perceive it, like if we're talking about Merleau-Ponty, and then Merleau-Ponty will throw in some line like, but I still believe that the world is there, like when we're not around, and then I'll move on to the next sort of analysis. And so those kind of like assertions, which I guess is to make us feel comfortable with his analysis that we can still believe in the real world, right? I find these problematic. Not that he can't say that kind of thing. I just don't think we should mistake that as a phenomenological finding, right? So he holds that commitment, but it's not the product of phenomenology, that assertion or that commitment. So just like if he writes a shopping list or something, like that's not a work of phenomenology just because it's written by a phenomenologist or something like that. Right? I think like Derrida says something about Nietzsche writing a note during a lecture about forgetting his umbrella, and then the question is this part of the Nietzschean corpus, right? I'm saying, no, maybe not. Okay. So it's certainly difficult to deny that phenomenology represents a fresh start in philosophy. It's arguably as radical as the critical philosophy initiated by Kant, even though Husserl and his adherents borrow quite a bit from Kantian transcendental philosophy, including its suspension of metaphysical speculation. Much of its radicality, however, is embedded in the realist rhetoric that forms a fundamental part of the poetics that phenomenology deploys to supplement its methodological constraints. Next, I'll lay out very briefly these constraints, these methodological constraints, so that my understanding of what phenomenology is or must be is transparent. I do believe that phenomenology is something. It does have a kind of existence. But I think for it to exist as a method, there's got to be a kind of, at least a couple of principles that a phenomenologist has to be committed to. And so I take a kind of stab at what I think what those are. These constraints I take to be both minimal and essential to phenomenological practice. So the minimal conditions for phenomenology. This paper does not intend, how much time do I have? When did I start? Quarter after? 20 after?
15 minutes.
All right. We'll see how that.
Is anyone worried about it?
Okay.
This is too good. Just keep
thank you. I'm tired of talking about phenomenology. I'm boring myself up here. No, only because I've read this so many times. It's exciting stuff. Okay. So this paper, I don't intend to somehow like police the doors or the boundaries of phenomenology for the sake of safeguarding the purity of the school or anything like that. I don't want to lament the recession of, or the regression of rigor or the recession of rigor, I should say, in phenomenological texts. I'm not trying exhaustively to specify the sufficient conditions of phenomenological practice, nor am I trying to enumerate the criteria that qualify something as evidence in the phenomenological sense. What I maintain is that for a philosophical description or study or conclusion to count as phenomenological, that is, to mark it as something other than everyday description, mundane description, empirical study, or speculative metaphysics, that description must take place from within some form of methodological reduction that shifts the focus of description to the transcendental, or at least the quasi-transcendental level. This is what differentiates the mundane from the philosophical as far as description goes. Since Husserl, several types of reduction are commonly identified, most notably the epoche, the phenomenological reduction, the transcendental reduction, the eidetic reduction. Right? Whether or not these reductions are genuinely multiple or just a variation on a singular reduction entailed in each of them is a kind of suspension or bracketing of what Husserl calls the natural attitude. A few which includes either an uncritical or critical belief in the reality of the external world. As Heidegger interprets it, in explicit contrast to its what he calls substantive intent, the reduction is what leads us from objectively present beings, or the ontic, to being itself, the transcendental or the ontological. He therefore puts the reduction to ontological use rather than using it as an epistemological or a skeptical tool after the manner of Descartes. Merleau-Ponty famously proclaims in the preface to the Phenomenology of Perception that the basic lesson of the reduction is that a complete reduction is impossible because of the incorrigibility of the real world. Like Cartesian doubt, this suspension does not lead us into positive disbelief in the world's existence. It instead requires us to withhold any belief, which is to say, neutralize our commitments or our commitment to either the reality or the unreality of the world as it's perceived. As our commitment in that sort of metaphysical sense, right? As such, the reduction is a prohibition against metaphysics. This, I think, is the absolute minimum condition of phenomenology. Without a suspension of the natural attitude and its attendant realism, without a strict commitment to phenomena as they appear to consciousness as the sole arbiter of truth, and without refraining from committing to anything that does not give itself phenomenally to consciousness, phenomenology cannot maintain its methodological integrity. Either phenomenology is a method whose basic principle includes a suspension of metaphysical commitments, precisely because the metaphysical status of phenomena is not revealed by the phenomena themselves, but is at best hinted at by the resistance or apparent transcendence of human consciousness. So either phenomenology is a method that suspends metaphysical commitments, or it's simply a name applied to a style of doing philosophy that has no coherent method for establishing the legitimacy of its claims. For phenomenology to be phenomenology, it must enact, at the very least, a suspension of the natural attitude and its concomitant metaphysics. This suspension requires the phenomenologist to confine his or her investigations to the much derided subject-object correlation. As Dan Zahavi puts it, quote, "The reduction, in contrast to the epoche, is the term for our thematization of the correlation between subjectivity and world," end quote. It is this confinement that lends phenomenology its transcendental flavor. More than mere description, phenomenology needs to describe the transcendental dimension of experience as it unfolds within experience itself. It's therefore more basic than the empirical. Without at least some attention to the transcendental, whether this is interpreted as the uncovering of consciousness's essential structures, like Husserl, or the return to pre-reflective experience, like Merleau-Ponty, it becomes nearly impossible to see the philosophical value or understand the institutional influence of phenomenological description. Otherwise put, phenomenology must at least adhere to Husserl's quote-unquote principle of principles from Ideas 1, section 24, which dictates that direct intuition is the origin of knowledge and to be respected as its own authority, and necessarily entails the view, today referred to as correlationism, that subject and object, consciousness and phenomenon, thought and being are an inseparable binary pair. The importance of the phenomenological reduction for 20th century continental philosophy cannot be overstated. It is a driving force behind the numerous attempts to overcome metaphysics and crucial to conceiving the end of metaphysics announced by Heidegger, Derrida, and everyone else sympathetic to deconstruction. It's therefore partly responsible for the linguistic turn taken by continental philosophers in the wake of phenomenology and deconstruction. And insofar as the resurgent speculative impulse witnessed in contemporary continental theory represents a direct confrontation with the linguistic turn's desire to overcome metaphysics, it's important to see that the phenomenological reduction is the first step toward the end of metaphysics. As John Sallis has shown, Husserl's epoche is nothing other than the installment of the phenomenologist within the correlation of consciousness and being, otherwise known by phenomenology as intentionality or immanence. The epoche enacts a reduction of transcendent being to immanent presence and converts real objects into, Husserl's term, irreal or intentional objects by neutralizing their existence and questions about their existence. As Sallis puts it, this is a little bit longer quote by Sallis, the epoche takes the form of neutrality modification, neutralizing whatever real existence the object might otherwise be taken to possess, especially that unanalyzed objective existence that things in the world are naturally taken to have. By undergoing the reduction brought by the epoche, objects come to be taken as being precisely insofar as they present themselves in an intentional experience. That is, as being precisely insofar as they are intentionally present. End of the quote. So from the phenomenological standpoint, objects cease to exist in the usual objective sense of the term. They take on a new mitigated form of reality as intentional objects, quote, real insofar as they are intended or thematized. They assume a kind of internal reality within the subject-object correlation, which means that if we wish to call Husserlian phenomenology, or any phenomenology that performs the epoche, if we wish to call it a realism, as Zahavi writes, quote, it has to be emphasized that it is a realism based on experience. It is an experiential realism or an internal realism, not unlike the one espoused by Hilary Putnam, having no affinities with metaphysical realism, end quote. If phenomenology is nothing without the reduction, and here I'm in agreement with Leonard Lawler and Eugen Fink, who make, quote, the reduction absolutely necessary for phenomenological research, then it's necessarily complicit with the end of metaphysics. It is a reduction that initiates the return to the things themselves, and which, as Sallis notes, quote, decisively exceeds the history of metaphysics, exceeds it in precisely such a way as to realize its intent and thus its end, and be thus its end, end quote. If metaphysics then is an attempt to either identify or align thought and being, or to render present to thought that which is as it is, then phenomenology accomplishes this end. But it does so at the cost of reducing the reality of being by rendering being dependent on human consciousness. It empties being of its real, in a strict sense, transcendence. It's true that phenomenology is replete with accounts of the excesses of being. I'm thinking here of Marion's saturated phenomenon, Levinas's wholly other, as well as Merleau-Ponty's claim about the impossibility of bracketing the world. But we must ask if these excesses are genuine evidence of a reality beyond consciousness, or merely an excess of consciousness itself, an internal or an intentional excess. Here I side with Alexander Schnell when he argues that the excesses of phenomenology, or what Husserl calls the potentialities of the ego's I can and I do, right? When Schnell argues that the excesses of phenomenology are always internal to intentionality, not evidence of the autonomous reality of what appears in the phenomena. I do not, however, endorse Schnell's claim that a closer look at what he calls phenomenological metaphysics, which I take to be an oxymoron. I don't endorse his claim that a closer look at phenomenological metaphysics can illuminate the speculative nature of phenomenology, mostly because I take phenomenological metaphysics to be an oxymoron. Sallis claims that phenomenology itself is capable at times of clarifying that which exceeds the subject-object correlation. He also claims that phenomenology adheres to certain, quote, positings that exceed phenomenology, end quote, which cannot be accounted for from within the phenomenological standpoint. For my part, though, I'd argue that while many phenomenologists affirm a reality that exceeds the subject-object correlation and claim to find evidence for this reality within the phenomenological standpoint, it's necessary to qualify their affirmation as non-phenomenological or speculative in order to flag its metaphysical nature. It seems that phenomenology is forced into a choice. Either it can prepare the groundwork for the end of metaphysics, or it can make itself compatible with metaphysical realism. It cannot be both things at once. If it chooses to bring metaphysics to an end, then it forecloses the possibility of a realist phenomenology. If it allows a return to metaphysics in order to accommodate certain theological or realist aspirations, then it can no longer be the harbinger of metaphysics' demise. How it conceives itself methodologically will inevitably betray its preference for one side or other of this dilemma. All right, one more page, a couple more minutes. So today, it's still believed that phenomenology can get us back in touch with the real. Since we are told realism is just as outdated as idealism, and both of them are in principle absurd, as Husserl put it. The closest thing to realism that we have on offer, it seems, is phenomenology. That is phenomenology when properly disengaged from Husserl's brand of Kantianism and converted to existential phenomenology, is the closest we can get to an encounter with the real. This, I think, is a myth. The belief that phenomenology gets us realism instead of a modified form of idealism or correlationism results from a misunderstanding of the internal relation between the method and the metaphysics of phenomenology. No matter how it is interpreted, phenomenology can only align itself with anti-realism. So what do the various materialisms and realisms associated with the so-called speculative turn in continental philosophy have that phenomenology does not? In a word, I think they have speculation. That activity denounced by Kantian critical philosophy and explicitly prohibited by phenomenological method. It's commonplace nowadays to point to the rejection or a radicalization of correlationism as the move that marks a philosophical position as speculative in this new sense. This is commonplace for a good reason. The anti-realism entailed in correlationism, which has oriented continental philosophy at least since Kant, and quite self-consciously in the 20th century, is precisely what is spurned by those working in the new metaphysics. We can, however, characterize the new metaphysics, speculative realism included, in a different way, in terms of its commitments. If phenomenology is committed to metaphysical neutrality and to a species of correlationism that legitimates only those statements that are evidenced from within the subject-object correlate, that is, within the reduction, then the new metaphysics begins with a commitment to the existence of a non-human reality outside of the subject-object correlate. It then dedicates, speculative realism that is, it dedicates itself to thinking, describing, demonstrating, and unleashing or proliferating that reality. Speculative philosophy, moreover, does not restrict itself methodologically to a particular region of research as phenomenology does. Whatever one may think of the arguments for realism these days, it cannot be said that they put themselves a priori in the bind that phenomenology does. This does not mean that anything goes in speculative philosophy, but that the range of metaphysical commitments up for grabs is much wider than it is for correlationist philosophies like phenomenology. It's less about limitation these days, it seems, and more about proliferation. So we'll end it there. Thank you.